Hi everyone, I'm so excited to be here talking to you all today, and I'm thanking Keisha tremendously for inviting me to speak to you guys. Also, please forgive me as I am reading off of my notes here. I'm excited to talk to you about part of the research I do as a greater dissertation project, and so as a kid, I can remember when I was first inspired by the 60s and 70s. Grew up in California. I feel like the hippie memory was very obvious and real there, so what I kind of became interested in when I started studying history was the 60s and 70s as period. And though these aren't necessarily like the hippies of yore, I'm really looking at activists during this period. So during the decades of the 60s and 70s, there was a particular activism I'm focusing on, something I call Chicana activism. And I hadn't really heard about what Chicana activism was until I was a senior in college. And if you look at the dictionary definition of Chicana, essentially it is referring to a woman or girl of Mexican descent. And this is really an appropriate way to describe many of the individuals I'll be talking to you about today and the sort of activism that they exuded. Essentially, this lecture is a small part of what a group of Mexican and Mexican American women did while they fought for their rights as Mexicans, as women, during the 1960s to 1980s. And so I'm sure you've heard by this point, about the importance of thinking of intersectional identities, and Keisha's probably filled you in, but just thinking about one's race, gender, age, sexuality, all of these things factor into how activism functions and how people are treated, right, in society, and they're basically perceived. So a general takeaway from this lecture, I hope, is that it's difficult to fight simultaneously for women's rights and minority rights, or those rights of Mexicans, during this time period. So the same thing goes for like the Black Panther Party, even the radical left. A really great book to kind of read more on this would be Laura Polito's Brown, Black, and Left, which I actually have here. It's called Black, Brown, Yellow, and Left Activism. So this is a really great one to read if you're interested in kind of comparisons between the different approaches to activism. So I'd like to get started here, and we'll just kind of get right to it and talk about the Chicana movement in terms of the Chicano movement. And so the Chicano movement really began at this National Chicano Youth Liberation Conference in March of 1969 in Denver, Colorado, where it was mostly a group of Mexican and Mexican-American men met together to find a single issue to serve as the common denominator of a new movement. And this was cultural nationalism. And so with ideas of what they called the Chicano identity, and this is the word they reclaimed to sort of talk about Mexican and Mexican-American population in the U.S., they decided to then pen what they called El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán. And with this plan, they really fought against what they called the foreigners, or the kind of white individuals in the United States, and they saw them as enemies. And so the idea of Aztlán, so that's A-Z-T-L-A-N, not like the lion from C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, which a lot of people they sound pretty similar. Anyway, this idea of Aztlán is that you have this entire western United States, and it belonged to the Mexican. Before the Treaty of Hidalgo of 1848, that was part of Mexico. And so these individuals are really explaining that, all right, like this still is our land. And there's really no claim to it in terms of like this white claim to the land. And so this was essentially part of the movement, was reclaiming the land, reclaiming the name Chicano, and saying, hey, this was essentially our land. If you're treating us as though we are not citizens in this land, that is incredibly unfair and not just. So this was kind of this cultural nationalism that came into being, and Chicano itself, it is a gendered term in that it can refer to both men and women, but in this case, really cultural nationalism and Chicano referred to the Chicano male. And this is where we have that masculinity, machismo, really coming into the fore. And machismo is kind of this masculine identity of a strong Mexican male who would then kind of beat figuratively, this white male. But there was no room for women in this movement. And so, most notably in the 1970s, Chicanas then decided to take a stand against this sort of nationalism and really take responsibility and to become part of La Causa, or the cause. The cause was the movement of these Mexican American people. And so with sort of this beginning, right, we have this cultural nationalism that starts as, this Mexican American population is starting to take form as an identity group. But you also have discussions of sexuality and gender within this movement, which are promoting a new Chicana identity. And it's something that women were beginning to discuss throughout the nation. So it's really hard, like as I'm saying all of this, these are all facts, but it's also really hard to pinpoint a universal feminist ideology across geographical place and time. So just to remind you all that this movement, while it was national in scope, it did vary from place to place, regionally. So we're going to talk about today some common threads that surfaced to talk about the masculine rhetoric and sexist tendencies that existed in the larger Chicano movement. Okay, so to consider the political aspects of these things, we're going to go to January 17th in 1970. This time we're going to talk about Crystal City, Texas, all right? So on that day in 1970, over 300 Mexican Americans met to talk about how they could become a political force in the United States politics. And so with that kind of question, they decided to form La Raza Unida Party. And this was the United Race Party. And to sort of start this political movement that really helped them to form, essentially, they were looking to form a third party. So you'd have Democratic, Republican, and La Raza Unida party as part of this movement, right? So this was the whole idea, to have an electoral presence. However, again, like as we saw kind of initially with this Plan de Aztlán, Chicanas realized that they were not part of this political discussion. So they officially began discussing how the Raza Unida Party was dismissive of gender issues during a convention. So they're starting to organize and make their own meetings on their own. So this convention was hosted by the Young Women's Christian Association. And it was hosted in Houston, Texas in 1970. And it was attended, they wanted to eradicate racism and eradicate sexism. And a group of women were pushing, really, to start a conference that was specifically for women and had all these issues addressed. So a year later is when the first Conferencia de Mujeres por la Raza, so this was the conference for women of the race, was hosted from May 28th to 30th in 1971. So what's important to realize about this conference is that it was organized specifically for Chicana women and around issues that they cared about. Some of these issues that were really important included issues surrounding women's bodies, such as birth control, abortion, information about sex and the pill, and also ideas of what this white liberation struggle looked like and how they could become politically active. And so one important thing about this conference to take away is that a lot of the rhetoric around the women's movement of the 60s and 70s paints it largely as a white kind of women lib movement. But at the same time as these women liberation movements, we have to remember that those who were considered brown, these Chicana women were still organizing and still very much looking at these similar issues, even if they didn't have a space in the larger white women's movement. They were creating their own movement here. And so when you look at the Chicana body and rights, this was a major part of this first conference. When you look at women's rights, the Chicana body and rights, this is a really important discussion to have in relation to this movement and how women were perceived more generally. And so this first Chicana conference had this really popular section called Sex and the Chicana, noun and verb. And in particular, this had a lot of conversation that was stirred around this idea of how Chicana rights fit into the larger Mexican and Mexican American culture. And so this had to do with issues of sexuality, with women in the community, agendas of what was patriarchal values, right? Like women were seen to stay at home, and especially this was true, and it's interesting in a lot of Mexican culture, the sort of machismo that exists, right? The roles of the women versus the roles of the men. Women very much were the caretakers of the home and the providers of the home, whereas the men were the ones who would go out and be in part of the outside workforce, right, and bring it back in. So there was that stark divide in these cultures, and realizing that was part of identifying with one another at this conference. Also, this is a really interesting lead-in to the women's sex education and even sterilizations that happened during this period of time. So Chicanas and other women of color were really equally concerned about involuntary sterilization. It was a procedure that doctors would often perform on poor women, non-white women mostly, who did not give their consent for these procedures in the 1970s. So this is a really interesting point because many Chicanas criticized the white women's liberation movement for the push for abortion rights because it ignored real issues surrounding economic ability to care for their children. So it's an interesting divide when you have women that are being sterilized without their knowledge, and it's kind of the opposite from the want to abort, and not have children. It's the want to have children and provide from them, but to be unable to, and to be, sterilized without your consent was really a huge issue in these communities. So, and a particular note, a really interesting woman with a great story to talk about would be Alicia Escalante. And so she established one of the really important Chicana rights organizations. It was the Chicana Welfare Rights Organization, or the CWRO, and this was in East Los Angeles in 1967, that she was able to establish and provide social services for Chicana and Black women on welfare, who may have otherwise experienced racist treatment from the country's social services. So this was a really important moment. In addition to this, there was also a case that's important to note. It was called Madrigal versus Killigan in 1978, and it was a bunch of women who, while at Alicia Escalante's healthcare service, realized they were all forcibly sterilized without their consent, and so they essentially then sued the hospital that did these sterilizations. And honestly, this was a moment where the judge and the jury ruled that the sterilization was nothing more than a miscommunication, though it wasn't successful in kind of defending these women. It also brought attention to the issue of forced sterilization. So this helped to organize women around this idea of fighting against forced sterilization, and the Mexican American Women's Organization was developed in 1974 to sort of continue to struggle for these reproductive rights, which again, are different from a lot of what the women's liberation sort of rights that we hear about. So again, I'm giving you a little bit of a taste of all sorts of activism and different facets of this activism that happened throughout the time. And so another important part of this, that we kind of talked about reproductive rights, was the campus and anti-war activism. And there was a 1973 speech, which was later published in her anthology, The Chicana Feminist, in which Martha Cotera, who's a very prominent Chicana activist, described the 1970s as, and I quote, an era of upsurge in activity and development for Chicanas without parallels, end quote. So indeed, women activists engaged in many organizations and overlapping causes that informed one another at this time. So Alicia Escalante, for example, who I mentioned was part of that, the reproductive rights campaign, she also rallied against the Vietnam War. So women were incredibly conscious of what kind of social and political happenings were going on at the time. So she also excited a crowd saying, I'd rather have my sons die for La Raza and La Casa than in Vietnam. And this really sort of went around this topic of soldiers, right? Mexican and Mexican-American soldiers who were serving their country abroad, but then did not have the same rights in the country. And this was really a major concern of women at the time. In addition, looking at women in Vietnam, there was this really interesting campaign that was also put forth by Elizabeth Martinez, who was a prominent Chicana feminist writer. And she wrote about the similarities between Mexicans and Vietnamese in terms of being oppressed forces, right? And there was this really interesting image that she showed. A North Vietnamese woman and a Chicana woman side by side working in an outdoor kitchen, and the parallels were really uncanny. So she's trying to say, hey, we're not that different from these people that we're, fighting against abroad. And this really was part of this Chicana protest of the war in Vietnam. Additionally, these kind of protests took place on college campuses. And so one of the most notable larger Chicano movements, Chicano student organizations, is known as MECHA, which is El Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. And this still exists today as an organization. But a month after this conference I opened with in 1969 in Denver, they established a meeting at University of California, Santa Barbara, is when they kind of coalesced into these organizations. And women were a part of these organizations, but again, it's that same sort of story of machismo taking over and them really not having a voice on the campus setting. Okay, so I could probably go on forever about Chicana activism. I'm just giving you a taste of certain movements on behalf of Chicana women during this time. So to kind of wrap it all up, just to bring it to the 1980s, there was this great resurgence in feminist thought, in Chicana feminist thought, and it really comes to a head with Gloria Anzaldúa's This Bridge Called My Back, radical writings by women of color, or writings by radical women of color, and I actually have one of Gloria Anzaldúa's book. This isn't the one, but this is Borderlands La Frontera, which is also very good and deals with similar thoughts. She co-authored it with the famous poet Cherry Moriega, and in this anthology, she talks about how women, as this pan-ethnic and cultural identity, this is women of all races, also sexuality, how they're thinking about the issues of women who do not necessarily fit into the movement or ideas of what is heterosexual. So she's creating this pan-ethnic and interracial coalition between Asian, Black, Latina, and Native American women to really look at how we can define a cultural pan-ethnic identity. And so in a way, the Chicana movement also becomes more inclusive throughout time. And this is this could be another lecture in itself, but it's trying to look at how a collective identity can be formed around kind of multiple means of oppression or multiple means of identity. If you're a woman, if you're a minority woman, etc. And so this hopefully gives you a small taste of those pursuits of empowerment that these women found themselves pushing for.